The best fighter aircraft Britain had ever built couldn't follow a German plane into a dive. Not because of the pilot, not because of the airframe, not because of the engine's power output or the aircraft's theoretical ceiling, or its rate of climb, which was, by 1940, better than almost anything Germany was putting in the air. Because of fuel delivery. A float bowl carburetor, a design principle that had been standard in piston engines since the 1890s. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 used a direct fuel injection system. When a German pilot pushed his nose down and went -G, fuel kept flowing to his engine without interruption. The Spitfire's carburetor did not work that way. The moment a Spitfire pilot followed him into that dive, the float bowl emptied, the engine coughed, cut out entirely in some cases, recovered in 3 to 5 seconds, sometimes longer. 3 to 5 seconds is a long time when someone is trying to kill you.
By the summer of 1940, Britain's air defense rested on two aircraft, the Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane was older, slower, more forgiving. It handled the bulk of the German bomber formations over southern England. The Spitfire handled the escorts, the Bf 109s tasked with keeping RAF fighters away from the bombers. It was, on paper, an even match. The Spitfire Mk1 had a Rolls-Royce Merlin 3 producing around 1,030 horsepower. The Bf 109E had a Daimler-Benz DB601 producing roughly the same. The Spitfire had a tighter turn radius. The 109 had a higher dive speed and a slight edge in straight-line performance above 20,000 feet. Both sides knew each other's aircraft well enough to have developed tactics around them. The Germans discovered the carburetor problem before the British admitted it publicly. Luftwaffe pilots reported it through official channels as early as the summer of 1940. They had worked out that a sharp push forward on the stick, a half roll into a diving break, would shake a Spitfire off a tail almost every time. Not because the Spitfire was slower, because its engine couldn't follow. By the time the British pilot recovered power and reacquired his target, the German was 400 yards ahead, pulling away. The RAF knew. Pilots were filing reports, squadron leaders were forwarding them. The information was reaching the engineering offices at Rolls-Royce and at the Air Ministry, which is another way of saying slow. To understand why this happened, you have to understand how a float bowl carburetor actually works and why it was, in almost every other situation, a perfectly reasonable piece of engineering. In a standard carburetor, fuel is drawn from a small reservoir called the float bowl into the intake airstream, where it mixes with air and feeds the engine. The float bowl maintains a consistent fuel level using a simple float mechanism, the same principle as a toilet cistern. As fuel is consumed, the float drops, a valve opens, and fuel refills from the tank above. Under normal flight conditions, gravity keeps fuel in the bowl. The system is reliable, simple, and easy to maintain. Now, remove gravity. Under negative key, the force experienced when an aircraft pitches sharply nose down, the pilot is pushed up into his harness and everything not fixed to the airframe wants to rise, including the fuel in the float bowl. The fuel lifts away from the jet that feeds it to the engine. The engine, starved of mixture, cuts out. In less extreme cases, it runs rough, surges, and recovers. In a hard pushover, it simply stops. The Merlin engine in the Spitfire ran on this system. The Daimler-Benz DB601 in the Bf 109 did not. German engineers had adopted direct fuel injection, a system that sprays fuel under pressure directly into the cylinders regardless of G-force. Under negative G, under positive G, inverted, in a vertical dive, the fuel kept flowing. The engine kept running. The RAF and Rolls-Royce were aware of this difference. The question was not whether the problem existed, the question was what to do about it, and when, and at what cost to the production schedule that was already under severe pressure. A full fix, converting the Merlin to direct injection, was years of engineering work. The manufacturing infrastructure wasn't there. The alternative was a modified carburetor, but that required testing, validation, and time. An engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment named Beatrice Schilling found a different answer. She proposed a restrictor, a small metal disc with a calibrated hole drilled through the center, fitted directly into the carburetor float chamber. The disc didn't cure the problem. It limited fuel flow during negative G maneuvers enough to prevent complete engine cutout. The engine would still run rough, it would still lose power, but it would not stop. The device required no new manufacturing capability and could be fitted by ground crew in under an hour. It was designed and tested in late 1940. It reached operational squadrons in early 1941, more than 6 months after the Battle of Britain had ended. The pilots who flew through the summer of 1940 flew without it, every one of them. The RAF's formal response to the carburetor problem began in earnest after a specific incident in September 1940, not because the evidence had suddenly become more compelling, but because a pilot with enough rank to force the question had finally put it in writing in terms that could not be filed away. The evidence before that point was substantial. Combat reports from No. 74 Squadron, No. 54 Squadron, and others described the same sequence. German pilot breaks into a dive, Spitfire follows, engine cuts, contact lost. The language varied, the pattern did not. What the Air Ministry had was a resource allocation problem dressed in engineering language. The Merlin production line was running at capacity. Rolls-Royce was already managing modifications to address other operational issues: supercharger staging, coolant system vulnerabilities, propeller pitch control. Each modification required engineering hours, testing cycles, and sign-off from multiple departments. The carburetor was one item on a list that was never short. Beatrice Schilling's restrictor disc, informally called Miss Schilling's orifice by the ground crews who fitted it, was not a secret. The principle was simple enough that several squadron engineers had attempted improvised versions before the official solution arrived. Some worked, some made the problem worse. The Air Ministry knew about the informal fixes and neither endorsed nor prohibited them. It waited for the validated solution. The validated solution took until March 1941 to reach frontline units in meaningful numbers. Between August and October 1940, the core months of the Battle of Britain, approximately 544 Spitfires and Hurricanes were lost in combat. Not all of those losses can be attributed to the carburetor flaw. Pilots were outnumbered, exhausted, and flying against experienced Luftwaffe veterans. The causes of any individual kill were rarely simple, but Luftwaffe after-action reports from that period document the dive-break tactic explicitly. German pilots were taught to use it. It was a trained response, not an improvisation. Fighter leaders, including Adolf Galland, referenced it in debriefs. The RAF knew this because intelligence was capturing those reports. The institutional failure here was not ignorance, it was prioritization. The people responsible for fighter production in 1940 were making decisions under conditions that were genuinely catastrophic. The threat of invasion was real, the production shortfall was real, and the engineering bandwidth was finite. The carburetor was a problem. It was not, in their calculation, the most urgent problem. That calculation cost pilots their lives, and it handed the Luftwaffe a tactical advantage they did not need to earn. They had it because of a float bowl and a production schedule. Schilling's disc solved it at the field level. The full engineering fix, converting the Merlin to a properly pressure-fed system, came later, with the introduction of the Merlin 61 and the Spitfire Mk9 in 1942. By that point, the Battle of Britain was 2 years gone. The Spitfire Mk9 was by most accounts the definitive version of the aircraft, faster, better at altitude, and with a carburetor system that finally kept pace with the aircraft around it. It entered service in June 1942. The gap between what the aircraft needed and what its engine could actually do in combat had taken the better part of 3 years to close. The pilots who needed it in 1940 had a float bowl, a prayer. A handful of Spitfires survive in airworthy condition. The most famous fly at air shows across the UK each summer, rolling, climbing, the Merlin engine producing that specific note that crowds recognize instantly. They are maintained by people who know every component intimately. The carburetor systems on the airworthy examples are carefully preserved, carefully tuned. They work perfectly under positive G. The real subject of this story isn't the Spitfire. The Spitfire was extraordinary. It remains one of the most refined aircraft designs in the history of powered flight, a machine that went through more than 20 major variants over the course of the war and remained competitive from 1936 to 1945. That is not a story of institutional failure. What this is a story about is what happens when a system designed for peacetime validation encounters a war that doesn't wait for the paperwork. The carburetor problem was identified. The fix was designed. The process that stood between the fix and the aircraft took the entirety of the Battle of Britain to complete. Beatrice Schilling solved it with a metal disc that cost almost nothing and required no new machinery. It was ready before the battle was. The validation process was not. No one buried this. No one deliberately withheld the solution. The Air Ministry did not hide it. Rolls-Royce did not suppress it. The people involved were working under genuine pressure in a genuine emergency, and the emergencies still outpaced them. That is the harder story, not malice, not incompetence, a system that moved at the speed institutions move, and a war that moved faster. The Bf 109 pilots who pushed their noses down over Kent and Surrey in the summer of 1940 knew exactly what they were doing. They had been briefed on it. They had practiced it. They used it because it worked. It worked because of a float bowl. If this is the kind of history you want, be engineering underneath the legend. Subscribe. There's more of it.